Step out of the car, now!
Officer, I've complied with everything. Please explain why.
Don't question me! Hands where I can see them!
My hands are visible. I'm asking for the reason for
You
this
think
stop.
you're above the law? You people always do. I am a federal...
The dashboard camera captured everything, every single word, every gesture, every moment that would completely destroy one man's life while vindicating another's dignity. What started as a routine traffic stop on a quiet Tuesday evening in suburban Ohio became a viral sensation that sparked national outrage and proved that even those sworn to uphold justice can find themselves on the wrong side of the law. Judge Samuel Richardson had been on the federal bench for 12 years. At 53 years old, he was respected by colleagues, feared by criminals, and known throughout the legal community as a no-nonsense jurist who believed deeply in the rule of law. He drove a modest BMW, lived in a quiet neighborhood, and had never so much as received a parking ticket. That Tuesday evening, he was driving home from a late court session when he made what should have been an inconsequential lane change. Officer Derek Collins had been patrolling the same stretch of highway for 8 years. At 39, he was a veteran of the force with what his supervisors called a solid record. What they didn't know, what nobody knew until that night, was that Collins harbored deep-seated prejudices that would soon be exposed in the most public way possible. He saw the BMW change lanes and decided to follow it, not because anything was wrong, but because something about the driver bothered him. The traffic stop began normally enough. Collins activated his lights, and Judge Richardson immediately pulled over to the shoulder. He placed his hands on the steering wheel, exactly as anyone who understands police encounters should do. He waited calmly as Collins approached the vehicle, probably thinking this would be over in 5 minutes with a simple warning or minor citation. Collins knocked on the driver's side window with his flashlight, harder than necessary. Judge Richardson rolled down the window and greeted the officer politely, asking what he could do for him. Collins immediately demanded to see license and registration. His tone was sharp, aggressive, completely inappropriate for what should have been a routine interaction. Judge Richardson reached slowly for his wallet, announcing his movements as he did so. When Collins saw the judge's identification, something shifted in his demeanor. The name Samuel Richardson meant nothing to him, but seeing that this was clearly an educated, successful man seemed to trigger something ugly inside the officer. Instead of explaining why he had made the stop, Collins began asking increasingly personal questions. Where was he coming from? Where was he going? What did he do for work? Judge Richardson answered each question patiently, professionally. He explained he was returning home from court. Collins asked what kind of court. The judge explained he was a federal judge. This should have ended the encounter immediately. Instead, it escalated it. Collins stepped back from the vehicle and ordered Judge Richardson to step out of the car. There was no legitimate reason for this command. The judge had committed no crime, shown no signs of impairment, and posed no threat. But Collins was now operating on pure prejudice and power, a dangerous combination that would prove catastrophic. Judge Richardson complied with the order, but asked why he was being asked to exit his vehicle. Collins didn't provide an explanation. Instead, he told the judge to place his hands on the hood of the car. Again, Judge Richardson complied, though he continued to ask what law he had allegedly violated. This is when Collins made his first major mistake. Rather than explaining the reason for the stop or conducting himself professionally, he began making comments about the judge's car, his clothes, and his neighborhood. He suggested that someone like Judge Richardson couldn't possibly afford such a nice vehicle legitimately. The implication was clear and deeply offensive. Judge Richardson maintained his composure, but his voice became firmer. He identified himself clearly as a federal judge and asked Collins to explain the basis for the stop. Collins responded by claiming the judge was being confrontational and uncooperative. Anyone watching the dashboard footage later would see that Judge Richardson was neither of these things. Collins then made his second major mistake. He called for backup, claiming he had a hostile subject who was refusing to cooperate. This was completely false, and the dashboard camera proved it. Judge Richardson stood calmly with his hands on his vehicle, speaking in measured tones, asking reasonable questions about why he was being detained. When the backup unit arrived, Collins briefed the second officer, Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez, telling her the driver was being difficult and might be under the influence of something. Rodriguez looked at the judge, who was clearly sober, well-dressed, and cooperative, and immediately sensed something was wrong with Collins's story. Rodriguez approached Judge Richardson and asked him calmly to explain his side of what was happening. The judge identified himself again and explained that he had been pulled over for an unexplained lane change and was now being detained without cause. Rodriguez asked to see his identification, and when she saw his credentials, her expression changed completely. She walked back to Collins and spoke to him in hushed tones, clearly trying to de-escalate the situation. She suggested they could handle this with a simple warning and everyone could go home. Collins refused. He was too deep into his power trip now, too committed to the narrative he had created in his mind about putting this uppity driver in his place. What happened next shocked everyone who later saw the footage. Collins approached Judge Richardson again and told him he was going to search his vehicle. When the judge asked on what grounds, Collins claimed he smelled marijuana. This was another lie that the camera would expose. Judge Richardson had never used drugs in his life, and there was certainly no odor coming from his vehicle. Judge Richardson, drawing on his legal expertise, clearly stated that he did not consent to any search of his vehicle. He explained that Collins lacked probable cause and that any search would violate his constitutional rights. This should have ended the matter. Instead, it enraged Collins further. The officer stepped closer to the judge, invading his personal space in an intimidating manner. He told Judge Richardson that he could do this the easy way or the hard way. The judge remained calm and repeated that he did not consent to a search and wanted to speak to a supervisor. Collins then made the decision that would end his career and change his life forever. He reached for his weapon. The dashboard camera captured the exact moment when Collins drew his service pistol and pointed it directly at Judge Richardson. The federal judge, faced with a loaded weapon aimed at his chest, slowly raised his hands. His voice remained steady as he asked Collins to please lower his weapon and explain what crime he believed had been committed. Sergeant Rodriguez immediately drew her own weapon, but not to support Collins. She aimed it at her fellow officer and shouted for him to holster his gun immediately. She radioed for additional units and a supervisor, her voice urgent and concerned. She understood that Collins had just committed a career-ending, potentially life-threatening mistake. Judge Richardson, even with a gun pointed at him, continued to speak calmly. He identified himself once more as a federal judge and asked Collins to consider what he was doing. He explained that this was being recorded and that pointing a weapon at a citizen without justification was a serious crime. Collins seemed to realize the gravity of his actions, but instead of de-escalating, he doubled down. He accused Judge Richardson of reaching for something in his car, another lie that the camera footage would later disprove. The judge had made no sudden movements and had kept his hands visible throughout the entire encounter. Additional units began arriving on scene, their sirens cutting through the evening air. Collins still had his weapon drawn, though Rodriguez continued ordering him to holster it. Judge Richardson remained motionless, his hands raised, probably calculating how this situation might end and whether he would survive to see his family again. The shift supervisor, Captain William Torres, arrived and immediately assessed the situation. He saw one of his officers pointing a gun at what appeared to be a cooperative, well-dressed civilian, while his sergeant had her weapon trained on that same officer. Torres quickly approached Collins and ordered him to lower his weapon immediately. Collins finally complied, holstering his pistol, but the damage was done. Everything had been recorded. Every lie, every escalation, every moment of misconduct was captured in high-definition video that would soon be analyzed by internal affairs, federal investigators, and millions of viewers online. Captain Torres approached Judge Richardson and apologized profusely. When he learned the judge's identity and position, his face went pale. He understood immediately that this incident would have consequences far beyond a typical police misconduct case. A federal judge had been held at gunpoint by a police officer during what should have been a routine traffic stop. Judge Richardson, finally free to lower his hands, straightened his jacket and looked directly at Collins. His words were measured, but carried the weight of someone who had spent years delivering justice from the bench. He told Collins that his actions were not only unprofessional but criminal, and that there would be consequences for what had just occurred. Collins tried to justify his actions, claiming he had felt threatened and was following his training. Captain Torres cut him off, ordering him to return to the station immediately. Rodriguez was assigned to escort Collins back, ensuring he didn't have any opportunity to tamper with evidence or coordinate a story with other officers. The judge was offered medical attention, which he declined. He was asked if he wanted to press charges, and his answer was immediate and definitive. Yes, he absolutely wanted to press charges. He also informed Captain Torres that he would be filing a federal civil rights lawsuit and requesting a complete investigation by the FBI. The dashboard footage was secured immediately, along with the body camera recordings from all officers on scene. Judge Richardson was given copies of all relevant documentation and incident numbers. Torres assured him that the matter would be investigated thoroughly and that Collins would be suspended pending the outcome. As Judge Richardson finally drove home that evening, probably shaken but determined, he likely understood that this incident would become much larger than a personal grievance. This was about accountability, about justice, and about ensuring that no other citizen would face what he had just endured. What neither he nor Collins knew at that moment was that this traffic stop would become a national news story, spark congressional hearings, and ultimately lead to significant changes in police training and oversight. The consequences were just beginning. The story broke 3 days later when a local news reporter received an anonymous tip about the dashboard camera footage. That reporter, Sarah Mitchell, had covered police misconduct cases before, but nothing quite like this. When she first watched the video, she had to replay it twice to make sure she was seeing correctly. A police officer had drawn his weapon on a federal judge during a routine traffic stop, and it was all captured on camera. Mitchell reached out to Judge Richardson's chambers for comment. Initially, the judge declined to speak publicly, preferring to let the official investigation process run its course. But when Mitchell explained that other media outlets were already picking up the story, Judge Richardson agreed to a brief interview. His words were careful, measured, but powerful. He explained that what happened to him could happen to any citizen, regardless of their position or status. The badge and gun don't make someone above the law, and when officers abuse their power, they must face consequences. He emphasized that his concern wasn't just personal, it was about the fundamental principles of justice and equality that he had spent his career defending. The video went viral within hours of Mitchell's report airing. Social media exploded with outrage, shock, and demands for accountability. The hashtag number Judge Justice began trending nationally. Legal experts weighed in, explaining how Collins had violated multiple constitutional rights and department policies in less than 30 minutes. Collins, meanwhile, was placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. His union representative released a statement claiming that Collins had acted according to his training and that the situation had been mischaracterized by the media. The statement fell flat. Anyone who watched the footage could see exactly what had happened, and no amount of spin could change the clear evidence. The police department found itself in an impossible position. They had an officer who had obviously committed serious misconduct, but they also had union contracts and procedures to follow. Chief Patricia Adams called an emergency press conference where she promised a thorough investigation and pledged that appropriate action would be taken. But the public wasn't satisfied with promises. Protesters gathered outside the police headquarters demanding Collins be arrested immediately. Civil rights organizations issued statements calling for federal intervention. Local politicians, sensing the political winds, began distancing themselves from the department and calling for reform. The FBI opened a federal civil rights investigation within a week. Agent Michael Foster was assigned to lead the case, and he knew immediately that this would be high profile and politically sensitive. A federal judge being held at gunpoint by a police officer wasn't just misconduct, it was a direct assault on the judicial system itself. Foster began by interviewing Judge Richardson, who provided a detailed account of the incident. The judge was cooperative but clearly frustrated by the entire situation. He had been doing his job, serving his community, and upholding the law for over a decade, only to be humiliated and threatened by someone who was supposed to protect and serve. Next, Foster interviewed Sergeant Rodriguez, who had witnessed the entire encounter. Rodriguez was clearly troubled by what she had seen. She explained that Collins had escalated the situation unnecessarily and that his decision to draw his weapon was completely unjustified. She confirmed that Judge Richardson had been cooperative throughout the encounter and had posed no threat whatsoever. Captain Torres corroborated Rodriguez's account. He told Foster that in his 25 years of police work, he had never seen such an obvious case of misconduct. Collins had violated every principle of professional policing and had endangered both the judge and his fellow officers through his reckless behavior. When Foster finally interviewed Collins, the disgraced officer's story kept changing. First, he claimed he had smelled marijuana and felt threatened. When confronted with the dashboard footage that contradicted these claims, Collins said he had made an honest mistake under pressure. When pressed further, he became defensive and eventually stopped cooperating with the investigation. The Internal Affairs investigation ran parallel to the FBI probe. Detective Amanda Clark was assigned to review Collins' entire career, looking for patterns of behavior that might have been overlooked previously. What she found was disturbing. Collins had received 14 citizen complaints over his 8-year career, significantly higher than the average officer. Most had been dismissed after cursory investigations, but reading them together revealed a troubling pattern. Collins consistently targeted minority drivers for pretextual stops, used excessive force during arrests, and showed disrespect toward citizens who questioned his authority. One complaint from 2 years earlier was particularly relevant. A black businessman had been stopped by Collins for allegedly speeding, though the man's GPS showed he was traveling at the posted limit. Collins had demanded to search the vehicle, and when the driver refused, Collins had threatened to call for drug dogs and make him wait for hours. The complaint had been dismissed because there was no video evidence, and it was the citizen's word against the officers. Another complaint involved a Hispanic family returning from vacation. Collins had stopped them, claiming their temporary license plate looked suspicious. He had ordered the entire family out of the vehicle, including 3 young children, and searched their belongings on the side of the highway. Nothing illegal was found, but the family was humiliated and traumatized by the experience. Again, the complaint had been dismissed. Detective Clark realized that the department had ignored a clear pattern of misconduct, allowing Collins to continue his discriminatory practices until he finally went too far with the wrong person. Judge Richardson wasn't just another victim, he was someone with the knowledge, resources, and platform to demand accountability. The district attorney faced intense pressure to file criminal charges against Collins. Prosecutors reviewed the evidence and determined that Collins could be charged with assault with a deadly weapon, false imprisonment, violation of civil rights under color of authority, and official misconduct. Each charge carried serious penalties, including potential prison time. Collins' attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the DA's office was unwilling to accept anything less than a felony conviction with jail time. The case was too high profile, the evidence too clear, and the public too outraged for a slap on the wrist. Judge Richardson's civil lawsuit was filed 6 weeks after the incident. His legal team, led by renowned civil rights attorney David Kim, sought damages not just for the judge's personal trauma, but for the systemic violations of constitutional rights that Collins' pattern of behavior represented. The lawsuit named Collins individually, but also the police department and the city, arguing that their failure to properly train, supervise, and discipline Collins had enabled his misconduct to continue unchecked. They demanded punitive damages that would send a clear message about the cost of allowing racism and abuse of power to flourish within law enforcement. Collins' personal life began unraveling as quickly as his professional one. His wife filed for divorce, citing the stress and embarrassment of being married to someone accused of such serious misconduct. His children faced bullying at school from classmates who had seen their father's actions on social media. The family home was vandalized with graffiti calling Collins a racist and demanding justice. Financially, Collins was devastated. Legal fees mounted as he tried to defend against both criminal charges and the civil lawsuit. His police union provided some support, but their resources were limited, and they were increasingly reluctant to defend such obvious misconduct. Collins was forced to sell his house and move his family to a smaller apartment across town. The psychological toll was equally severe. Collins had built his identity around being a police officer, seeing himself as a protector of the community. Now he was universally reviled as a symbol of everything wrong with American policing. He began drinking heavily and isolated himself from former colleagues who no longer wanted to be associated with him. Meanwhile, Judge Richardson continued his judicial duties with quiet dignity. He refused most media requests, preferring to let the legal process speak for itself. But colleagues noted that the incident had affected him deeply. He spoke more frequently about civil rights issues from the bench and seemed more aware of the power dynamics inherent in the justice system. The case became a teaching moment for law schools across the country. Professor Elena Santos at Northwestern University used the dashboard footage in her constitutional law classes to illustrate how quickly a routine encounter can escalate into a federal civil rights violation. Her students were shocked by the clear evidence of racial profiling and abuse of power. Police departments nationwide began reviewing their own training protocols and complaint procedures, fearful of facing similar scandals. The Collins case had shown how expensive and damaging it could be to ignore patterns of misconduct. Several departments implemented new policies requiring supervisory approval for vehicle searches and mandatory body cameras for all officers. Civil rights organizations seized on the case as evidence of the need for broader police reform. They organized rallies and lobbied for legislation that would make it easier to prosecute officers who violate citizens' rights. The case became a rallying cry for activists who had long argued that police accountability was more rhetoric than reality. 3 months after the traffic stop, Collins was formally indicted on all charges. The grand jury had deliberated for less than 2 hours before voting unanimously to indict. The evidence was overwhelming, and several grand jurors later said they were shocked that such behavior had been allowed to continue for so long. Collins' trial was scheduled for 6 months later, giving both sides time to prepare their cases. But everyone involved knew that the dashboard camera footage would be the key evidence, and it told a story that no defense attorney could credibly dispute. The consequences of that Tuesday evening traffic stop were still unfolding, but one thing was already clear. A 30-minute encounter had changed multiple lives forever and sparked a national conversation about police accountability that would continue long after the legal proceedings concluded. The media attention intensified as more details emerged about Collins' history. Investigative journalists began digging deeper into his personnel file, uncovering incidents that painted a disturbing picture of an officer who had been allowed to operate with impunity for far too long. Television news programs featured legal analysts explaining how the case represented a perfect storm of police misconduct, systemic failure, and digital evidence that couldn't be disputed or explained away. Collins' defense team, led by veteran criminal attorney Robert Hayes, faced an almost impossible task. How do you defend the indefensible when it's all captured on high-definition video? Hayes knew that traditional defense strategies wouldn't work here. He couldn't claim the footage was doctored or taken out of context. He couldn't argue that Collins felt threatened when the video clearly showed Judge Richardson cooperating fully. Hayes was left with only one possible approach, arguing that Collins had made a mistake under pressure, not committed a deliberate civil rights violation. But even that strategy crumbled under scrutiny. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Walsh, methodically demonstrated that Collins' actions weren't the result of split-second decisions made under stress. The traffic stop had lasted over 20 minutes before Collins drew his weapon. He had multiple opportunities to de-escalate, multiple chances to recognize his mistakes, and multiple warnings from his own supervisor through Sergeant Rodriguez. Walsh brought in expert witnesses who testified about proper police procedures during traffic stops. Captain James Mueller, a use of force instructor with 30 years of experience, explained to the jury that nothing in Collins' training would have justified drawing a weapon on a cooperative motorist. He pointed out that Collins had violated at least 7 department policies during the encounter, each one a fireable offense on its own. The prosecution also called Dr. Sarah Chen, a psychologist who specialized in implicit bias in police behavior. Dr. Chen testified about how racial prejudice can manifest in law enforcement, often unconsciously at first, but sometimes escalating to deliberate discrimination. She explained how Collins's pattern of targeting minority drivers suggested deeper psychological issues that the department should have identified and addressed years earlier. Judge Richardson took the stand on the third day of trial. The courtroom was packed with reporters, activists, and curious observers who wanted to hear directly from the victim of Collins' misconduct. The judge's testimony was measured and precise, befitting someone who had spent years in courtrooms. He described the encounter in clinical detail, explaining how Collins had escalated the situation at every turn despite his complete cooperation. Under cross-examination, Hayes tried to suggest that Judge Richardson had been confrontational or threatening in some way. The strategy backfired spectacularly. The judge calmly referenced specific timestamps from the dashboard footage, pointing out exactly when he had asked polite questions, when he had complied with commands, and when he had identified himself as a federal judge. Hayes' questions only served to highlight how professional and restrained Judge Richardson had been throughout the ordeal. The defense called character witnesses for Collins, including his former training officer and several colleagues who testified about his dedication to the job. But their testimony felt hollow against the weight of the video evidence and the pattern of complaints that had emerged during the investigation. One witness, Officer Gary Stevens, admitted under cross-examination that he had heard Collins make racially insensitive comments in the past, but had never reported them. Collins himself never took the stand. Hayes advised him that his changing story and defensive attitude would likely make things worse with the jury. Instead, the defense tried to argue that Collins had been inadequately trained and supervised, essentially throwing the police department under the bus in hopes of reducing his individual culpability. The strategy didn't work. After deliberating for just 4 hours, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts. The foreman, a middle-aged accountant named William Park, later told reporters that the video evidence was so clear that there was really nothing to debate. Collins had violated Judge Richardson's rights, period. The only question was whether his actions were criminal, and the jury unanimously agreed they were. Collins showed no emotion as the verdicts were read. His wife, who had attended every day of the trial despite their pending divorce, broke down crying. She later told reporters that she still loved the man she married, but couldn't recognize the person she saw in that dashboard camera footage. Sentencing was scheduled for 6 weeks later. Under state guidelines, Collins faced up to 8 years in prison for the most serious charges. The prosecution requested the maximum sentence, arguing that Collins had not shown remorse and that his position of trust made his crimes particularly egregious. The defense pleaded for leniency, claiming that Collins had already lost everything and that prison time would serve no constructive purpose. Judge Harrison Mills, who presided over the criminal trial, had known Judge Richardson professionally for several years. He recused himself from determining the sentence to avoid any appearance of bias, and the case was reassigned to Judge Patricia Vance. Judge Vance had a reputation for being tough on police misconduct cases, having previously sentenced 3 officers to prison terms for various violations. The civil lawsuit moved forward on a parallel track. David Kim, Judge Richardson's attorney, had assembled a formidable legal team that included former federal prosecutors and civil rights specialists. They were seeking damages that could reach into the millions, arguing that Collins' actions had caused not just personal trauma, but institutional damage to the justice system itself. The city's insurance company initially tried to deny coverage for Collins' actions, arguing that his misconduct fell outside the scope of his employment. But legal experts pointed out that Collins was on duty, in uniform, and using his police authority when he committed the violations. A federal judge ruled that the city was liable for its employees' actions, regardless of whether those actions were authorized. Settlement negotiations began 6 months after the criminal conviction. The city was eager to avoid a lengthy civil trial that would keep the incident in the news and potentially result in an even larger judgment. Judge Richardson's legal team was demanding $8 million in damages, plus reforms to the police department's training and oversight procedures. The financial impact on the city was staggering. Legal fees, settlement costs, and the expense of implementing court-mandated reforms would eventually total over $12 million. City council members who had initially supported the police department began calling for the chief's resignation and demanding explanations for how Collins had been allowed to remain on the force despite numerous complaints. Chief Adams found herself testifying before the city council, trying to explain how her department's systems had failed so completely. She admitted that the complaint investigation process was inadequate and that supervisors hadn't been properly trained to identify problem officers. Several council members called for her immediate termination, arguing that the department needed new leadership to rebuild public trust. The police union, which had initially defended Collins, began distancing itself from the case as public pressure mounted. Union President Mark Johnson released a statement condemning Collins' actions and promising to support reforms that would prevent similar incidents. Privately, union officials were furious that Collins had created such a public relations disaster for law enforcement. Collins' sentencing hearing attracted national media attention. Victim impact statements were read from several people who had been stopped by Collins over the years, including the businessman who had nearly missed his father's funeral and the Hispanic family who had been humiliated during their vacation. Judge Richardson chose not to read a statement himself, feeling that his testimony during the trial had said everything necessary. Judge Vance sentenced Collins to 6 years in prison, noting that his abuse of power had damaged not just his immediate victims, but the entire criminal justice system. She explained that police officers are held to a higher standard precisely because they carry weapons and have authority over citizens. When they abuse that authority, the consequences must be severe enough to deter others from similar conduct. Collins was taken into custody immediately after sentencing. His mugshot, showing a man who looked far older than his 39 years, became another viral image associated with the case. He would serve his time in a medium security facility 3 hours away from his family, eligible for parole in 4 years with good behavior. The aftermath of the Collins case rippled through law enforcement agencies nationwide. Police chiefs reviewed their complaint procedures, prosecutors examined their policies for charging officers, and training academies updated their curricula to emphasize de-escalation and constitutional rights. The dashboard camera footage became a standard training tool, showing recruits exactly what not to do during a traffic stop. Judge Richardson returned to his normal caseload, but colleagues noticed changes in his judicial philosophy. He became more skeptical of police testimony in criminal cases, more willing to suppress evidence obtained through questionable stops, and more vocal about the need for police accountability. His experience as a victim of misconduct gave him insights that few judges possessed. The settlement with the city was finalized 8 months after Collins' conviction. Judge Richardson received $4.2 million in damages, most of which he donated to civil rights organizations and legal aid societies. He kept enough to cover his legal expenses and establish a scholarship fund for minority law students, but made clear that money had never been his primary motivation. The city implemented sweeping reforms as part of the settlement agreement. All officers were required to complete additional training on implicit bias and constitutional rights. A civilian review board was established to investigate complaints against police. Body cameras became mandatory for all officers, and dashboard cameras were upgraded to ensure better audio and video quality. Collins's former colleagues struggled with the fallout from his actions. Several officers requested transfers to other departments, unable to handle the scrutiny and criticism that came with being associated with his misconduct. Recruitment became more difficult as the department's reputation suffered, and community relations programs were expanded to try to rebuild trust with minority residents. The case became the subject of academic studies examining police accountability and judicial oversight. Law professors wrote articles analyzing the legal precedents established by Judge Richardson's lawsuit. Criminologists studied Collins' personnel file to identify warning signs that supervisors should have recognized. The consensus was clear. This incident could have been prevented if proper oversight mechanisms had been in place. 2 years after the traffic stop, Judge Richardson was invited to speak at a national conference on police reform. His remarks were measured but powerful, emphasizing that accountability wasn't anti-police, but pro-justice. He argued that good officers should welcome reforms that help identify and remove bad actors who damage the profession's reputation. Collins, serving his sentence in state prison, reportedly spent his time in the law library researching appeals. Legal experts gave him little chance of overturning his conviction, given the overwhelming evidence against him. Prison officials said he kept to himself and rarely discussed his case with other inmates, many of whom had been arrested by police officers and had little sympathy for a disgraced cop. The ripple effects continued expanding as other victims of police misconduct found their voices. The publicity surrounding Judge Richardson's case encouraged people to come forward with their own stories of mistreatment by officers. Civil rights attorneys reported a surge in complaints and lawsuits as citizens realized that even routine police encounters could result in serious violations of their rights. The dashboard camera that captured Collins' misconduct became an unlikely symbol of accountability in the digital age. Technology that was originally installed to protect officers from false accusations had instead exposed one officer's criminal behavior. Police departments nationwide upgraded their recording equipment, realizing that clear documentation could protect good officers while exposing bad ones. As the third anniversary of the traffic stop approached, the case continued generating discussion about police reform and civil rights. Judge Richardson had transformed from victim to advocate, using his experience to push for systemic changes that would protect other citizens from similar treatment. Collins remained in prison, a cautionary tale about the price of letting prejudice and power corrupt the sacred duty to serve and protect. The story was far from over, but one thing was certain. A routine traffic stop had exposed the best and worst of American justice, proving that accountability was possible when brave people refused to accept injustice and when technology captured truth that could not be denied or explained away. So there you have it. One dashboard camera, one traffic stop, and one man's decision to let his prejudice override his oath to protect and serve. Officer Derek Collins walked into that encounter thinking he could intimidate and humiliate someone with impunity. He was wrong. Judge Samuel Richardson stood his ground with dignity and courage, proving that justice can prevail when good people refuse to accept injustice. Collins lost everything: his career, his family, his freedom, his reputation, all because he couldn't see past the color of a man's skin to recognize his humanity. Meanwhile, Judge Richardson transformed his trauma into a catalyst for change, using his experience to make the system better for everyone who comes after him. This case proves that accountability is possible, even when it seems impossible. Technology captured the truth. Good officers like Sergeant Rodriguez chose what was right over what was easy. The justice system worked the way it's supposed to work, and citizens across the country learned that their rights matter, regardless of who tries to violate them. The next time you see a traffic stop, remember this story. Remember that every encounter between police and citizens is an opportunity for justice or injustice, respect or abuse, accountability or cover-up. And remember that sometimes, just sometimes, the arc of justice bends exactly the way it should. Thanks for watching. If this story opened your eyes or changed how you think about police accountability, let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe because stories like this matter, and they need to be told. If you think this situation was bad, wait until you see what happens in the case on the right-hand side.